Hello and a very warm welcome to the video. Thank you for joining it. Before I start, I should like to thank Alexander Nietzberg, who is a translator working out of Vienna in Austria. He has translated works of Spenser, sonnets of Spenser, into German and many Russian works besides, and it was he who brought my attention to this extraordinary document which I've been mulling over for about a month or two now and finding a lot of interesting things in it. I suspect there is much more, and I will welcome comments if people spot things that they think I may have missed. Now, who was Andreas Gryphius? Well, he is not known much in the Anglosphere, but he's still highly regarded in Germany as a lyric poet and a dramatist. The Latin writing down below I can translate for you. He whom fruitful Germany admired as a tragic poet, who struck our stony hearts with a bolt of lightning, this is how he looked. The accumulated knowledge of things and all that the vast world contains shines out from those writings bequeathed to us by his divine spirit. In Elysium, Gryphius will be a second Pallas. I think that idea that the writings were bequeathed to us by his divine spirit is something we've come across with Shakespeare, of whom it is frequently said in the documents of the time about him that his works were written by him and by God, by the grace of God within him. So this is pointing already towards a sort of Hermetic philosophy, perhaps a proto-Masonic philosophy. Now, I should just explain why I've called this presentation Andreas Gryphius New. Many will be totally aware why I've called it that, because it's part of a long series that I've already put up online, all taking the title So-and-so New. What did they know? Well, a big secret about English history and English literature. Those who follow my presentations will know what that secret is. The rest of you do stick with this and you will find out. If you're then keen and then interested, watch some of the videos that are put up on the right there, because they all corroborate this very fascinating and secret fact. Now back to Andreas Gryphius and this engraving on the left. What can we tell just from looking at it? Well, one of the most obvious things you note is that his left hand is hidden, and as we all know, a hidden hand is a sign of a Freemason, as is the holding of gloves. Gloves in themselves are, of course, a symbol of the hidden hand, and if you're really particular about these things, you might look closely at that hand and say, why are his fingers separated like that, 3 and 1, and note that that too is another form of Masonic signalling. If we look at the hand of a very famous Freemason, George Washington, in this picture you see the 3+1 hand shape, and actually if we go to this picture of him also, you see he's holding out a piece of paper. This is the 3+1 on his bare hand there, and his other hand, his left hand, is a hidden hand. It's wearing a glove. In fact, if you look at the 3 characters behind him sitting at the table, you'll see each of those also has a hidden hand. Very obvious sign of Freemasonry. Here is George Washington standing right outside the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia, and he is handing a Masonic apron to Benjamin Franklin, and that apron, of course, is hiding one of his hands, and one could go on. Here's another picture of Washington with a bare hand and a gloved hand, and etc., etc. Almost every time one sees pictures of Washington, he seems to be hiding one of his hands, and this is his way of telling us all that he is a Freemason. So I think it's pretty clear that Andreas Gryphius, even though he was pretty early in date, was part of some sort of Freemasonic movement, and that becomes even clearer when you look at the frontispiece engraving to his book of his works, which was published in 1657. Here it is. You can see the figure of death or mortality. The skeleton is carving on a tomb. On either side of him is a rather maudlin, bare-breasted monarch, and on the other side what could be Father Time holding a torch, a light. Maybe that's emblematic also of Lucifer. If we look down on the tomb, we can see the square and compass, the most famous signs of Freemasonry. Go back to our friend George Washington, you can see the square and compass on his Masonic apron here, and an interesting eye just above it, something not dissimilar perhaps from this cloud with a hole in it, very eye-like, and very similar to the designs of Robert Flood, the 17th century Rosicrucian and Freemason. Another Freemasonic sign down here, the little cherub with one of his eyes covered. If we look a little bit closer, we can see that the skeleton who's doing the carving is taking his cue from this. He's actually carving these words, E Gryphi, Trauerspiele, Oden, Sonetta. In other words, the tragedies, odes and sonnets of A. Gryphius. And this is an idea also that connects us to Shakespeare, if you remember, who says that his monument shall be his works. Gryphius was actually alive when this frontispiece engraving was made and published, and so what is being written on the tomb is Gryphius's works, and that again is a very Freemasonic concept. As to, if we look very closely, we can see that he hasn't actually finished carving the A. So what you actually have there is the Greek letter lambda, which is the 11th letter of the Greek alphabet, and a very obvious 11 also there displayed by the tool. So you have 1111. 1111 BC was the founding of the Temple of Solomon, something which lies at the very heart of all Freemasonic meditations. Perhaps those two columns in the back are Yakin and Boaz, the two columns of the pillars of the Temple of Solomon. So I mention all this really to point out that there is no doubt, why there is no doubt in my mind, that Gryphius was a Freemason, and we're going to see the relevance of that in just a moment. I've opened the book. Here's one of his plays, which is about the murder of Majesty, or Carolus Stuardus. This is obviously a play about the King of Great Britain, King Charles I. In this portrait I've put up on the left, you can see that one of his hands is exposed and shows that 3+1 symbolism, and the other one is rather hidden. And King Charles was supposedly the Grand Master of the English Freemasons from 1625 to 1630. His wife, Henrietta Maria, went into exile in The Hague, where she set up a court with Thomas Lord Arundel, who led her there and helped her there. And Arundel himself was also Grand Master of the English Freemasons from 1633 to 1634. Now, why I mention this is because Henrietta Maria's court in exile, the court in The Hague, was obviously situated where Andreas Gryphius was living in The Hague, and it's thought very much that he was part of the English court entourage and the Dutch court there, and so he would have come into contact with these people, which is what inspired him, no doubt, to write the play about King Charles and his execution, which happened in 1649. Now, if we go through the book, we'll find you have 777 pages of plays. That's the number of this page, and I'll leave you to go to Google and see the Masonic relevance of the number 777. But here, you can see it comes to an ender, or does it? Well, if you turn the page, it doesn't quite, because we find there's another play here, Absurda Comica. I think that translation isn't needed. Oder Herr Peter Schwentz, or Peter Quince, Schimpfspiel, which I think means a sort of prank play. Now, this is peculiar because we are starting the page numbering again after page 777, and it was not admitted that this play was in this book. At least it wasn't on the engraved frontispiece, as we saw, which only mentioned the Trauerspiele, Oden and Sonnet, the sonnets, odes and tragedies. And even on the title page itself, we have Trauerspiel, Oden, Sonetta. Nothing is said about this play here. It's almost as though this play is in some way being disowned. And it's quite interesting, because when one looks into the history of it, there seems to be an almighty row about who actually wrote it. If I take you back to the 18th century, here is a mention of the Ludus Scenicus, the comic play Peter Schwentz, and it has a footnote P, and if you go to that footnote, it's written in Latin, but I'll tell you what it says. Although the poetical works of Gryphius included this play, it was not, however, Gryphius, as was once commonly assumed among the learned, but Schwenter who wrote it. This commentator goes on to say he knows this because his father-in-law actually owned the manuscript. So it looks like this person is a rather good source. However, there is another source from the 17th century which says that Gryphius did write it, or at least he borrowed it from Schwenter and then reworked it. Well, let's ask the question, first of all, who is Schwenter? He's called Daniel Schwenter, and there's a picture of him. He was a very clever and learned professor from Altdorf. He was a professor of Hebrew who wrote several treatises on the pronunciation of Hebrew and Hebrew letters and words, and a Hebrew-Latin dictionary published in 1628. He was also a scholar of Arabic. You can tell that by the book in front of him there. One page is Hebrew and one page is Arabic. And he was also a scholar of maths, a mathematician, and that's why he has the book of Euclid there. Euclid, of course, especially interested in geometry, something which preys very deeply on the minds of Freemasons. We seem to be going round and round in circles here. Indeed, he published anonymously a book called Steganologia, a book of secret codes, and you can see a page of it here. Secret codes, again, very much part of Freemasonic thought. So I am placing him very much into the world of Freemasons, as does a professor from the University of Prague, František Kederovec, who says that Daniel Schwenter was a celebrated German scientist, a mathematician and linguist. He wrote a series of scientific books and also under the pseudonym Schweighardt, some Rosicrucian books, among which perhaps also the famous Fama Fraternitatis, on which the Rosicrucian Society was founded. Not so sure about the last bit, but he presents his evidence. Very interesting about the first bit, that he was using the pseudonym Schweighardt. On another presentation, I have shown you this very remarkable engraving, which comes from a book of Schweighardt. There you can see the rose and the cross. It's a Rosicrucian mystery, this particular engraving, but I brought it up on a video called Kepler's Supernova Explodes the Stratfordian Myth. Do go and have a look at it if you haven't seen it already. I was very proud of it, as it showed how these two extraordinary stars, one from Serpentaria and one from Cygnus, are alluded to in the last 6 lines of Ben Jonson's famous eulogy to Shakespeare from the first folio of 1623, and how that tells us that Ben Jonson knows that Shakespeare died very shortly before October 1604. Please have a look at it if you haven't seen it. As I say, I'm rather proud of that one, and I'd love it to have more views and more following. There's another one that comes after it about a man called Holland who actually seems to agree with me in the 1620s. Anyway, I'm going slightly offline because what I'm trying to tell you is that Daniel Schwenter, who is one of the possible authors of this play, is also a Freemason, along with Andreas Gryphius, another possible author. Now, what is so extraordinary to me about this is we have here, in effect, a play whose authorship is disputed, which acts as a play within a book of plays. And if we look closely at this play itself, we discover that it is all about a play within a play whose authorship is disputed. If we go to the dramatis personae and look straight away, we can tell what that play within a play is, because there are 2 characters, one acting Pyramus and one acting Thisbe. Well, the Pyramus and Thisbe story derives anciently from Ovid, but the most famous play within a play of Pyramus and Thisbe is, of course, the play done by the rude mechanicals in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. If we look at the other parts here, we have the moon, the wall, and the lion. That firmly takes it away from the Ovid source and towards the Shakespeare play within the play of Pyramus and Thisbe. One only has to look at the names of the so-called mechanicals. We have Peter Schwentz, well, that's very like Peter Quince, is it not? And Meister Bulle-Boutin, which is very like Master Bully Bottom, is it not? We can also see in the jobs that these mechanical have Tischler, Leinweber, joiner and weaver, reminding us of Snug the joiner in Midsummer Night's Dream and Bottom the weaver. So I don't think there's anyone ever who has argued that the original source of this play within the play, this Pyramus and Thisbe, is not William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. Doesn't mean it's an exact copy of it, but it is the original source, and all scholars agree to that. I'll just point out that one of the parts played here, which is not in Shakespeare, is Der Brunn, the spring, and that will become relevant why I bring that up now shortly. Let us then have a look at this play within the play, which begins on page 17 and runs all the way through to this page, Telos Amen Dixi Finis Enda, page 40. So the play within the play runs from page 17 to page 40. Note how the words at the bottom I've highlighted there, telos amen dixi finis ender, that ender is written in the German script, and the other words, telos amen dixit finis, all foreign words and therefore written in, well, what is the equivalent to the italic script. Of course, it's normal script, but coming out of the German script, it's like italic. Anyway, the point I want to make is that the play within the play runs between pages 17 and 40, and I really don't know how many times, in how many presentations, I've highlighted the importance of 1740 to the name William Shakespeare, to the signature of Edward Oxenford, to the tomb where Edward Oxenford was buried to commemorate Shakespeare, and which was erected in 1740 and has 1740 4 times on it, and so on and so on and so on. There are countless examples of this. The number of his name, as John Dee would have put it, that appear in references to Shakespeare by his contemporaries and near contemporaries, with clear associations to the English proto-Masonic Brotherhood. It is, to my way of looking at this, a very important key to unlocking the whole of the authorship mystery. But I don't want to bore people to death who regularly watch my videos by going over every single time how this 1740 works and how we know it is solid. Please, if you've coming across this for the first time, watch a video I put online called The Incalculable Genius of John Dee, and all is explained carefully, slowly and sensibly there. For the rest of us, let's move on with this interesting fact that the Shakespeare Pyramus and Thisbe originated play in this play of Peter Scrence runs between pages 17 and 40. Let us now go back to page 17 where the whole thing starts, and let me give you a vague sense of the surface meaning of what is going on here. Now, what's very interesting is it starts off with a discussion of the authorship of this play. It starts with the words of Peter Scrence, who says, Dieses Spiel habe ich, Herr Peter Scrence, Schulmeister und Schreiber zu Rumpelskirchen selber gemacht, which means I, Peter Quince, schoolmaster and writer of Rumpelskirchen, wrote this play myself. Pretty unambiguous statement, one would have thought. Serenus, who is the prince sitting in the audience, not taking part in the play, riposts, der Vers hat schrecklich viel Füße. The verse has an awful lot of feet. That's a joke about the I ams, of course, to which Peter Quince replies, all the better to walk with, another silly joke. But I want to concentrate on what he says lower down about the authorship. 5 Actors hat das schöne Spiel. This beautiful play has 5 acts, of which I myself wrote 3. An odd thing to say, he's just said he wrote the whole thing. He goes on to say, Master Lollinger, the linen weaver, put together the other 2, and then says, rather mystically, he's a master singer and not an ox, who prides himself in equivox. Well, equivox is not a German word, it's actually an English word. If I bring it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, it can mean a thing which is called by the same name as something else, an expression capable of more than one meaning, ambiguity of speech, double meaning in words or phrases used, or the use of words in a double meaning with intent to deceive. So very similar really to the English word equivocal, which of course is about using words in a double sense in order to mislead people. So already this is quite interesting. He said something bizarre, that 2 of the acts were written by this man called Lollinger, who is no ox, but who prides himself in equivocation. That's the double use of words, and one wonders if there isn't a double use of words going on here. For instance, the name Lollinger, this strange man, is it a coincidence that Gehr in German means a spear, or that Lollin, which comes from the old German word lullen, lollen, lallen, can mean to sing in a low voice, but also to pronounce indistinctly or stammer, to babble or to quaver. In fact, there is a dialect German word, Lollin, which means to tease or to mock. The same word more commonly in German is shaken. So one is wondering, is one not, whether there's some connection between Lollinger and the name Shakespeare. Another very strange oddity is this word ox. Look how it is written. It's not just that it doesn't mean anything to say he's a master singer and no ox. I have tried many Germans of my acquaintance and said, have you ever heard of the phrase that someone isn't an ox? And they've never heard of it. So this bamboozles everyone, and even the most learned scholarly editions of this play don't seem to understand what is being said when he's saying he is no ox. If you're an Oxfordian, of course, and you know that Oxford was often called Ox, you know exactly what's happening. But the question for the German is, why is this word ox an English word? Ox in German is O-C-H-S-E, oxa. Why is it in English? Why is it in double capitals, unprecedented in this play? Why is it in the quasi-italics, i.e. it's been taken out of the German script? All other nouns are in German script, so he's trying to indicate, is he not, that this is a foreign word. He is drawing attention to the word ox, just as he draws attention to the English word equifox, never mind how it's spelt, and also to actos. Again, this is a Spanish word, it's not a German word. You would say Akten in German. 5 Akten hat das schöne Spiel. So he's putting some foreign words in. What other foreign word can you see marked out here on this page? Well, that's the 17th word of the dialogue, and it happens to be vers. Well, that's not a foreign word, that's a German word, so why has he bothered to put it in this italic form? Well, the only obvious answer is he's trying to draw attention to the fact that it has a double meaning, that it's part of the equifox, the equivocation, and that it is actually an English word, and it's talking about the English surname Veers, and der Vers obviously sounds very like de Veers. And another odd thing about this, not only is it the 17th word, he's noting it as a foreign word, Veers, but he's also got a comma after it. Since when did you ever put a comma between the subject and the verb? Der Vers hat schrecklich viel Füße means the verse has an awful lot of feet. But he's put der Vers comma, and that comma gives the sense of pause, especially to an actor, and gives the sense of some word that is missing. Maybe the word play or the word work is what is missing here. Der Vers hat schrecklich viel Füße, that the work of De Vere has an awful lot of feet. In other words, a great deal of footprints that seem to be associating themselves with this work, including those of Daniel Schwenter, Gryphius, Master Lollinger, etc., etc. The point being here then, on page 17, where we have the 17th word, is Veers. We have this person who's claiming to have written this play, or some of it, who is no ox, but a master of equivocation. There are just too many nods, winks, taps of the nose here, not to be deeply suspicious and deeply aware that this author knows who actually was behind Shakespeare, that it was De Vere. And of course all that is crowned by the fact that this play within the play runs from page 17 all the way to page 40. Now I'd like to finish up, if I may, with a few comments on this very extraordinary epilogue that is read by Peter Quince at the end of the play within the play. He tells a most bizarre story, and I have not succeeded in finding any scholar who's looked at this and is able properly or sensibly to explain what this story is about and why it should conclude the tragedy of Pyramus and Thisbe. It's the story of a Christian who carries on his shoulders a dead Jew, and it's a very hot day, and they get to a narrow bridge, and because of the heat and the weight of the Jew on his shoulders, the Christian decides to take a drink by a nearby well, a deep well, tiefer Brunn, and he takes the drink, or tries to, but the weight of the Jew upon his shoulders is so great that he is pushed into the well, where he is drowned and essentially where he is buried. And at the end there he says, and this shows that a dead person can indeed bury a live one. Well, what is all this about? and why would you end Pyramus and Thisbe with this extraordinary story? It's clearly allegorical, and it clearly has a meaning that is relevant. If you're Oxfordian, as I say, you might be very tempted to link what is said on page 17 about the authorship of the Pyramus and Thisbe to what is being said here on page 40, this allegory of the dead Jew who buries the Christian. May I tentatively attempt, therefore, to explain this allegory from an Oxfordian perspective, that the Christian, or the living works thereof, represented by Edward de Vere, the true Shakespeare, nod nod, wink wink, who was essentially buried by the deceased Hebrew scholar Daniel Schwenter. And he was buried, or killed, if you like, in the deep well, the spring well, which represents the rejuvenation, the rebirth, if you like. And in the dramatis personae, we had Der Brunn, the well, acted by none other than Master Lollinger, whose name, if you remember, is associated obliquely with Shakespeare, and who is no ox, but the equivocator, who is now being put forward as the author of Pyramus and Thisbe, in other words, Shakespeare. So what we're seeing here is the rebirth of the works of Edward de Vere under the name of Shakespeare, Lollinger, the Spring, due to his burial by a deceased Hebrew scholar, Daniel Schwenter. Certainly that ties page 40, the end of the play Pyramus and Thisbe, with the very beginning of it on page 17. I hope that all makes sense to you. I hope that at very least you're as suspicious as I am that this play is dealing with the authorship question, and therefore shows something extremely interesting, that this proto-Masonic secret was being transmitted not just within England but also abroad through these Masonic networks. That to me is the real takeaway from this piece of evidence. But I'm sure there's more in it. I'm sure that you, good watchers of these videos, will spot more things and enlighten me further. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you will subscribe, share, like, do all those sorts of things, and that you will join me for the next video that I put up online. Thank you very much indeed for watching.